Hey guys, tonight we begin with the bizarre and often ridiculous final moments of those who were supposed to be the most dignified humans alive. Royalty, kings, queens, emperors. Their lives were filled with ceremony, power, and gold-threaded robes. But their deaths, well, let's just say some of them would rather be forgotten. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. King Adolf Fredrik of Sweden, death by desert. Of all the ways for a monarch to exit this world, in battle, by betrayal, or on a velvet deathbed surrounded by sobbing nobles, King Adolf Fredrik of Sweden chose desert. It was February 1771, a chilly evening, and Adolf Fredrik, like many of us after a stressful day of doing absolutely nothing important, decided to treat himself, except his idea of a treat was a culinary suicide mission. The royal menu that night was ambitious. It began with lobster, then caviar, then sauerkraut, smoked herring, and champagne. Not one glass. No, several. Enough to make even the royal wig feel dizzy. But none of that killed him. What did him in? 14 servings of semla. Now, if you're not Scandinavian, semla is a sweet roll made of wheat, cardamom, and almond paste, topped with whipped cream and floating in warm milk. It's delicious. It's heavy. It's the kind of dessert you eat one of, that's enough. Adolf Fredrik had 14. That's not dessert. That's a sugar-based assassination. His servants must have been horrified. Somewhere between roll number 10 and 13, someone surely said, "Your Majesty, perhaps a digestive walk." But the king waved them off, spoon in hand, cream on his lips, determined to go out in style. And he did. Later that evening he complained of stomach cramps, which progressed to pain, then collapse, and then the official cause of death, digestive problems. That's putting it mildly. The man ate himself into oblivion. His legacy, a relatively peaceful reign, some administrative reforms, and the title of the king who ate himself to death. You've got to hand it to him. There are worse ways to go. He wasn't assassinated. He didn't fall off a horse. He didn't die of plague or a cursed goblet. He was taken out by pastry. And honestly, that's kind of majestic in its own way. So next time you reach for a second slice of cake and hear that little voice in your head say, "Why not?" just remember King Adolf Fredrik and maybe, just maybe, put the spoon down. King George II, Royal Lou exit. Royalty tends to imagine its final moments with a bit of ceremony. A deathbed farewell, a fading breath whispered in Latin, perhaps a full orchestra humming gently in the background. But King George II of Great Britain? He died on the toilet. Yes, you read that correctly. It was the morning of October 25, 1760. King George II, in his late 70s, woke up feeling a bit off. Still, he followed his usual morning routine. Some light conversation, maybe a touch of royal grumbling, and then, as all men must, a visit to the privy. Except he didn't return. Moments later, servants rushed in and found the monarch slumped over the chamber pot. He had suffered a sudden aortic aneurysm, a rupture of the body's largest artery, and died instantly. So yes, technically he died of natural causes, but the location? Unforgiving. Let's take a moment to imagine it. The King of England, Elector of Hanover, defender of the faith, meeting his end not in bed, not on horseback, but half-sitting mid-business pants at royal half-mast. Hardly the portrait you want framed over the fireplace. To be fair, the chamber pot itself was no peasant's bucket. We're talking porcelain, possibly gold-rimmed, and surely flanked by servants trained in the art of not reacting. But still, it's the kind of death that gets whispered about. In footnotes, not sung in ballads. The physicians wrote it up respectfully. The public was told he died of a heart problem, which was technically true, but the full story was preserved thanks to court gossip and a few very honest palace attendants who couldn't let it go. And neither has history. Because for all his accomplishments, his wars, his reforms, his reign over an empire, George II is remembered most clearly for being the only British monarch to die on the toilet, a legacy no one asked for and no one has matched. He ruled an empire and died like a man. Sigurd the Mighty, bitten by a dead man. Some royal deaths are tragic, others are absurd. And then there's Sigurd the Mighty, who managed to die from something even Shakespeare couldn't have invented, a bite from a man who was already dead. Let's rewind to the 9th century. Sigurd Einstein, better known as Sigurd the Mighty, was the Earl of Orkney, a Viking leader, fierce warrior, and all-around Norse tough guy. He spent most of his life raiding, conquering, and terrorizing the northern British Isles. Then one day he defeated his Scottish enemy, a rival chieftain named Maelbrea. In a move that screamed Viking confidence and questionable hygiene, Sigurd tied the man's severed head to his saddle as a trophy of war. Now, this was a common practice in Viking circles, brutal, yes, but considered a solid day's work. The problem? Maelbrea's head still had teeth. As Sigurd rode home in triumph, the head bounced around, as severed heads tend to do when tied to saddles. At some point during the bumpy ride, one of the dead man's teeth scraped Sigurd's leg, a minor cut. Nothing to worry about. If you're not living in the 9th century, with zero antibiotics and a complete disregard for infection control, the wound became infected fast. And just like that, the victorious Viking who had slain dozens, conquered territories, and taken down a warlord died from a scratch. Not just any scratch, a osteus bite. That's not just ironic. That's cosmic slapstick. Imagine being remembered as the war hero who was taken down not by an ambush or a blade, but by a mouth that wasn't even moving anymore. Historians don't know if Sigurd's men laughed, cried, or just quietly untied the head and walked away. Probably all three. Sigurd's story is now a legend. And honestly, it deserves to be. Not because of the conquests, but because he might be the only Viking in history who lost a jewel to dental hygiene. Crown Prince Sardo, death by rice chest. There are royal deaths that make you chuckle. And then there are those that make you slowly put down your chopsticks. Enter Crown Prince Sardo of Korea, heir to the throne of the Joseon dynasty in the 18th century. A young man born into privilege, groomed for power, and eventually remembered as the prince who died inside a box. Not metaphorically. Literally. Sardo had issues: mental health, violent outbursts, erratic behavior. Call it what you will, but the court described him as dangerously unpredictable. He was known to execute servants on a whim, and was rumored to wander the palace at night with a sword, muttering to himself. As you can imagine, this made him unpopular. Now, his father King Yongjo was a Confucian monarch, calm, composed, and painfully concerned with appearances. Executing one's own son would have been politically messy and spiritually scandalous, but leaving him alive, that was even riskier. So the king came up with a creative solution. He had Sardo placed inside a large wooden rice chest, the kind normally used to store grain. It was mid-July in Korea, which, for the record, is not a pleasant climate for enclosed spaces. There was no ventilation, no water, and no hope of a quick end. Sardo survived for 8 agonizing days. No trial, no blade, just a slow, sealed descent into history as one of the most uncomfortable royal demises ever recorded. It's the kind of death that makes you appreciate exile or even decapitation as a kind option. The official records, cleaned up for posterity, state that Prince Sardo passed away due to divine judgment, which is poetic. But let's be honest, he was riceboxed to death. Ironically, his son Jongjo would go on to become one of Korea's most celebrated rulers. The family never publicly spoke of the box incident, but historians never forgot. It's a tale of palace politics, mental illness, and tragic cruelty, wrapped in wood and sealed with silence. So next time you're complaining about tight spaces or summer heat, just remember Crown Prince Sardo, and be thankful no one's solving family drama with furniture. King Martin of Aragon, killed by laughter. If you've ever been told that laughter is the best medicine, allow us to introduce you to the one man in history who quite literally overdosed on it. King Martin of Aragon. The year was 1410. Martin, nearing the end of his reign and battling digestive issues, because no royal story is complete without gastrointestinal drama, had spent the day in bed, not from injury but from chronic flatulence and indigestion, the kind of royal wind that clears out courtiers. That evening, he demanded the presence of his personal jester. His request: a joke, something light, something funny, anything to lift his bloated spirits. The jester delivered. The joke, as preserved in court accounts, went something like this. "Why did you take so long to arrive?" the king asked. The jester replied, "Because I saw a young deer hanging from a fig tree by its tail, and I had to wonder if it was an act of divine punishment." Now maybe it was the timing. Maybe it was the delirium. Maybe it was the fact that the king hadn't laughed in weeks because he was too busy digesting a goose. But whatever the reason, Martin burst into hysterical laughter. And he didn't stop. Within moments, he was gasping, clutching his stomach, and finally collapsing. The official cause of death: indigestion and uncontrollable laughter. Yes, King Martin of Aragon literally laughed himself to death. There's something both tragic and deeply undignified about it. Monarchs are supposed to die heroically on the battlefield in a marble hall, or at least during a dramatic monologue. Martin, he met his end with a joke about a deer and a fig tree ringing in his ears. The succession crisis that followed his death plunged the crown of Aragon into a political mess, but no one could discuss it without stifling a grim chuckle. His advisors must have struggled to write that report with a straight face. "Your Majesty has passed while laughing extremely hard." In the end, Martin's death became legend, proof that, yes, humor can kill. So laugh wisely, guys, especially after dinner. Emperor Qin Shi Huang, poisoned by immortality. If ever there was a man determined not to die, it was Emperor Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor of a unified China, and the kind of ruler who didn't just dream of immortality, he demanded it. Ruling in the 3rd century BC, Qin Shi Huang was a powerhouse. He standardized Chinese currency, measurements, and writing. He built roads, walls, and armies. He even commissioned the legendary Terracotta Army, a life-sized battalion of clay soldiers designed to protect him in the afterlife. Although, as it turns out, he wasn't exactly planning on using them. You see, Qin Shi Huang had no intention of dying. He was obsessed with the idea of living forever, and he tasked his court alchemists and physicians with delivering that dream. Their solution? Mercury pills. Tiny, shimmering, toxic capsules that were marketed as elixirs of immortality. The science behind it? Non-existent. But it had a shiny glow. And in ancient China, shininess often implied power. The emperor, convinced he was drinking life itself, began taking these mercury-based treatments daily, not occasionally, daily. The result? His health began to fail. He became paranoid, erratic, and prone to long absences from the court. On one of these trips, a secretive inspection of eastern territories where he hoped to find more magical life-extending ingredients, he collapsed and died, poisoned ironically by the very thing he believed would make him eternal. The court panicked. His death was hidden for days to prevent political instability. During that time, to keep the ruse going, his entourage reportedly traveled with a wagon of rotting fish to mask the smell of his rapidly decomposing body. Yes, the emperor who feared death so deeply ended up fermenting next to seafood. To this day, Qin Shi Huang's tomb remains unopened, a literal mountain of secrets. Some scholars believe it may be surrounded by rivers of liquid mercury. Fitting, really. The man wanted to be preserved forever. And in a way, he is not as an immortal legend, but as a cautionary tale about trusting quack science and glowing pills. Pope John XII, a heavenly scandal. The papacy has seen its fair share of drama, political intrigue, religious reform, crusades, and schisms. But few popes ever reached the level of papal chaos achieved by Pope John XII. Born Octavianus, he became pope in 955 AD at just 18 years old. Now, becoming the spiritual leader of millions before you're old enough to rent a chariot? Not ideal. And the result? Even less ideal. John XII quickly became known less for sermons and more for scandal. His papal palace reportedly resembled less the seat of Christendom and more a Roman frat house. He gambled. He drank. He allegedly ordained a 10-year-old as bishop. He blessed a man's mistress. He even raised toasts to the devil during Mass. It's no surprise then that his death was equally unorthodox. According to multiple chroniclers, Pope John XII died of a stroke, but not during prayer, not at the altar. No. He reportedly suffered that stroke while in bed with a married woman. Let that sink in. The Pope died mid-affair with someone else's wife. That's not just scandalous. That's a moral black hole. Now, to be fair, the Vatican never released an official statement confirming this account, possibly because back then, official statements were written by monks who preferred not to die of embarrassment. But the rumor took on a life of its own. Even centuries later, historians couldn't quite agree whether it was truth or a very juicy smear campaign. But let's say for a moment it was true. Imagine being the priest assigned to write the eulogy. Here lies Pope John XII, shepherd of the faithful, viceroy of Christ, and frequent visitor of marital bedrooms. His death marked the end of one of the most infamously unpapal papacies in history. He reigned for just under a decade, and in that short time he managed to blur nearly every line between sacred and profane. And so, Pope John XII joins our list not just for how he died, but for how spectacularly he ignored the job description. He came, he sinned, he stroked out. And history never forgot. King Alexander of Greece, monkey business. Royal duties can be dangerous, war, assassination plots, the occasional poison goblet. But King Alexander of Greece? He was killed by a monkey. Yes, a monkey. It was 1920. Greece was balancing on the edge of political turmoil, and Alexander, a young and relatively inexperienced king, had been placed on the throne while his father was exiled. He wasn't exactly in charge, more like a placeholder in a crown. So imagine the surprise when the news broke. The king had been attacked in the royal gardens by monkeys. Here's how it happened. One afternoon, Alexander was walking through the royal estate with his beloved dog. Suddenly, a Barbary macaque, a type of monkey known for being both clever and incredibly short-tempered, appeared. It belonged to a palace worker who apparently didn't see the problem in letting monkeys roam free near royalty. Naturally, the dog and monkey started fighting. And like any loyal pet owner, Alexander tried to break it up. That's when a second monkey appeared. The two monkeys, not thrilled about royal interference, turned on Alexander and bit him repeatedly on the leg. The wounds didn't seem serious at first. He was patched up. No big deal. But days later, infection set in. Then gangrene. Then sepsis. Within 3 weeks, the king of Greece was dead from a monkey bite. The fallout was immense. His death triggered a constitutional crisis, a return of his father to the throne, and helped push Greece into further instability. So yes, a monkey attack led to geopolitical chaos. The press at the time didn't know what to do with it. Bitten by a monkey didn't quite fit the traditional royal obituary format, so it was softened. Vague phrases like an unfortunate injury or sudden illness were used instead. But the truth? It couldn't be covered up. Alexander's reign had been short and largely uneventful, but his death unforgettable. He may have worn a crown, but he was ultimately taken down by 2 small primates who never even got names in the history books. And that's how you become the answer to the strangest trivia question in royal history. Which king was killed by a monkey? King Charles II of Navarre, death by candle. When you think of royal death, you might imagine swords, poison, or at the very least a dramatic fainting spell after a scandalous banquet. But King Charles II of Navarre? He went out in a way that was both absurd and slightly flammable. Let's set the stage. It's the late 14th century, and Charles II, also known as Charles the Bad, yes, that was his official nickname, wasn't doing so great. He was sick, very sick, possibly suffering from some degenerative illness brought on by a lifetime of political scheming, betrayal, and general unpleasantness. His doctors, equipped with the finest medieval understanding of medicine, which is to say none, came up with a cutting-edge treatment: wrap the king from head to toe in linen soaked in brandy. That's right, brandy bandages, because when in doubt, marinate the monarch. The idea was to warm his body, draw out the illness, and possibly pickle him into health. It might have even worked if the final step hadn't involved sewing him into the linen cocoon and leaving a servant to snip the thread. Enter the candle. The servant, working late by flickering candlelight, leaned in to make the final cut, and then, as court historians describe with both horror and dark amusement, the flame touched the linen. Now remember, the king was soaked in alcohol. He went up like a torch. The servant panicked. There was screaming, chaos, probably a few nobles fainting in the corridor. But by the time they extinguished the king, it was too late. Charles II died in one of the most undignified ways possible, accidentally barbecued by his own nurse. The irony was thick. A man who spent his entire life plotting others' downfalls, poisoning rivals, switching alliances, betraying kings, was ultimately undone by his own drip-dry bandage and one inattentive assistant. And so Charles the Bad, who had once ruled with fire and fear, met his end as firewood. Let it be a lesson: never mix royal treatments with open flame, especially if your nickname is already the Bad. King Edmund II, death on the Privy. Some royal deaths are dramatic, some are symbolic. And then there's King Edmund II of England, who allegedly met his end in the most vulnerable position a man can be in, sitting on the toilet. Known as Edmund Ironside because the second just wasn't intimidating enough, he reigned for only 7 months in 1016. His nickname came from his battlefield grit and refusal to yield to Danish invaders, particularly King Knut the Great, who was breathing down England's neck at the time. Edmund fought like a lion, enduring defeat, betrayal, and political chaos. He was everything you'd expect from a tough Anglo-Saxon king until the very end, when all that martial glory was overshadowed by what happened in the Privy. According to a persistent and suspiciously detailed medieval rumor, Edmund was assassinated while using the toilet. A would-be killer, knowing the king's schedule and digestive reliability, hid beneath the wooden seat, and when Edmund sat down, surprised, dagger from below. Gruesome. Dignified? Not remotely. The official record is murky. Some sources say he died of wounds after battle, others mention an unnamed private treachery. But a few chroniclers, clearly blessed with imagination, describe the whole scenario in remarkable detail, right down to the killer hiding in the cesspit and striking upward. It's the kind of story that feels like political slander. And yet, it stuck, because nothing erodes a legacy like death by outhouse ambush. Imagine the scene: Edmund, perhaps humming a victory tune, sitting down after a long campaign, thinking he's finally earned a quiet moment, and then betrayal from below. It's not the stuff of royal murals. It's the stuff of cautionary tavern tales. To be fair, if the assassination tale is true, it was a cunning move. A king is never more defenseless than mid-privy. No armor, no guards, no sword, just linen, gravity, and unfortunate trust in 11th century plumbing. So whether fact or folklore, Edmund II's death reminds us that even Ironside kings have soft spots, especially when seated. King Henry I, too many eels. Of all the fatal indulgences in royal history, King Henry I of England may take the prize for the most slippery. Because in 1135, the king who had ruled for over 3 decades, survived war, political turmoil, and rebellious barons, was finally defeated by, wait for it, a plate of lamprey. If you're not familiar, lampreys are jawless, eel-like fish with a mouth that looks like it belongs in a medieval torture chamber. They were considered a delicacy back then. Today, we'd probably call them nightmare noodles. Henry I, however, loved them. He was known to be absolutely obsessed. His court physicians, who understood very little about medicine but a great deal about guessing, had repeatedly warned him against eating so many of them. They were considered rich food, heavy on the digestion, light on survivability. Did Henry listen? Of course not. He was a king. And what's the point of being monarch if you can't defy every medical warning in existence? So during a visit to Normandy, Henry sat down to a grand meal and consumed a surfeit of lampreys, meaning he ate way too many of these slippery, slimy medieval sea worms, not fried, not dipped in anything respectable, likely just boiled and arranged in a grim little pile. Shortly after, he fell violently ill, abdominal pain, vomiting, fever, the full royal digestive meltdown. Within days, he was dead. The official cause, food poisoning. His body was embalmed and sent back to England in the winter cold. And there are horrifying details about the journey that we won't get into here. Let's just say preservation was not a strong suit in 12th century Europe. Historians agree he was a capable and often ruthless ruler. But none of that mattered when his love for a grotesque fish dinner landed him 6 feet under. It said his doctors had begged him to avoid the dish. His response? I'd rather die than give up lamprey. Well, mission accomplished. King James II of Scotland, blown up by cannon. Kings have died in battle. Kings have died of illness. But King James II of Scotland? He died by standing too close to his own cannon. It was 1460. James was 29 years old, ambitious, and known for 2 things: a famously short temper and a deep love of artillery. This was the golden age of cannon warfare. By golden, we mean wildly unpredictable and prone to spontaneous combustion. At the time, James was laying siege to Roxburgh Castle, a stronghold still occupied by the English. Determined to show off his shiny new cannons, James ordered a demonstration and naturally wanted a front-row seat. Because what could possibly go wrong when standing a few feet from a 15th century cast iron powder tube packed with explosives? Plenty. As the cannon was being fired, it exploded instantly, violently, spectacularly. A piece of the barrel tore through James' thigh, severing his leg, and according to some reports, part of his torso. The blast was so intense that it killed him almost instantly. His attendants, probably still trying to process the phrase, "Your Majesty just detonated," fled in shock. The king's death threw the Scottish army into temporary chaos, but to their credit, they regrouped and eventually captured the castle. In fact, they later renamed it James's Castle, perhaps as an ironic tribute to the king who donated his limbs to the cause. It was a deeply Scottish end, dramatic, loud, and involving at least one piece of medieval technology failing in the most catastrophic way possible. The ironic twist? James had been a huge advocate for modernizing Scotland's artillery. He loved cannons, loved the sound, the smoke, the firepower. He just didn't love basic safety distance. Today, James II is remembered less for his politics and more for being one of the few monarchs in history blown up by his own enthusiasm. Emperor Elagabalus, too weird to live. If the Roman Empire ever needed a poster child for, maybe let's tone it down, it would be Emperor Elagabalus. Born Varius Avitus Bassianus, which already sounds like a spell, he became emperor in 218 AD at just 14 years old. That's right, a teenage emperor. Combine that with near unlimited power, vast wealth, and a complete disregard for anything resembling restraint, and you get one of the most bizarre reigns in Roman history. Elagabalus didn't just bend rules, he melted them down and made jewelry out of them. He appointed a horse as a government official, a trend among Roman eccentrics, insisted on being called empress instead of emperor, and once invited guests to a feast and dropped rose petals on them until some suffocated. His personal life was just as chaotic. He reportedly married 5 times, including once to a Vestal virgin, which was illegal, and was famous for dressing in women's clothing, wearing makeup, and offering money to any physician who could surgically convert him into a woman. In modern terms, we might call him gender nonconforming or fluid. But in ancient Rome, this made him a scandal wrapped in a toga. While his behavior shocked Roman elites, what really got him in trouble was his disregard for Roman religious traditions. He tried to replace Jupiter, king of the gods, with Elagabal, a sun deity from Syria. He even built a massive temple and made senators watch as he danced around a sacred black stone. Eventually, the Praetorian Guard, Rome's version of the Secret Service but with more daggers, had enough. In 222 AD, they assassinated Elagabalus and his mother. Their bodies were dragged through the streets, dumped into the Tiber River, and the Roman Empire collectively hit reset. Elagabalus was only 18 when he died, a teenager with too much power, too many parties, and far too little impulse control. Historians still debate whether he was a misunderstood visionary or just a chaotic tornado in a silk robe. But one thing is clear: his reign was too weird, too wild, and for Rome, just too much. Catherine the Great, rumors that outlived her. Few rulers in history had reputations as grand or as scandalously misunderstood as Catherine the Great of Russia. She was a brilliant reformer, a patron of the arts, a political powerhouse who expanded the Russian Empire and corresponded with Voltaire. But if you mention her name at a dinner party, chances are someone will mumble something about a horse. Let's get this out of the way. No, Catherine did not die in an intimate encounter with a stallion. That myth, persistent, absurd, and thoroughly untrue, was cooked up by her enemies after her death. It has no historical basis and says more about 18th century gossip than it does about Catherine herself. The real story? She died of a stroke in 1796, at the age of 67, while using the toilet. That's it. She collapsed in her private quarters and never regained consciousness. Quiet, undramatic, and very human. But why the horse rumor? During her reign, Catherine made powerful enemies, both foreign and domestic. She was a woman ruling alone in a male-dominated empire, unapologetically intelligent and known for her passionate personal life. She had lovers, sure, but so did many kings before her. The difference? Catherine's conquests were documented and scandalized, while her male counterparts were praised for theirs. After her death, political rivals and bitter aristocrats seized the opportunity to undermine her legacy. The horse rumor, vulgar and absurd, was tailor-made for enduring humiliation. It stuck not because it was believable, but because it was too shocking to forget. It's the royal version of a bad tabloid headline that just won't go away. So while Catherine expanded Russia's borders, modernized its administration, and helped drag the empire into the Enlightenment, she's still haunted by one fake equestrian footnote. In the end, she didn't die with drama. She didn't die in battle. She died like many before her, quietly, privately, and with history refusing to let her go with dignity. If there's a lesson here, it's this: power is fleeting, but rumors have long legs, especially when they involve horses. Emperor Valentinian II, the bathtub death. No one can explain. Most royal deaths have an explanation: a battle, an illness, a misjudged eel. But Emperor Valentinian II of Rome? His death remains a mystery that's been floating quite literally for over 1,600 years. Let's rewind to the year 392 AD. Valentinian II was only 21 years old. He had technically been emperor since the tender age of 4, because nothing screams qualified to rule the Roman Empire like still being in diapers. But as with most child emperors, someone else was really in charge. That someone was a general named Arbogast. Now Arbogast wasn't subtle. He was essentially using Valentinian as a puppet while pulling the strings behind the scenes. The young emperor, understandably not thrilled about being a royal mannequin, started pushing back. Tensions rose. Political whispers turned into threats. The palace air got heavy with accidental death energy. And then, one morning, Valentinian was found dead in his bath, not in the middle of a lavish feast, not stabbed on the Senate floor, just peacefully drowned in a tub. No bruises, no blood, just a lifeless young emperor floating awkwardly like the end of a badly written mystery novel. Arbogast, of course, claimed it was suicide. A convenient and very tidy explanation. Historians, however, have long doubted that story. Valentinian was young, ambitious, and had just begun asserting his authority. Suicide? Unlikely. Political murder? Now that's more Roman. But because no one actually saw it happen, and because forensic science back then amounted to, well, he's not breathing, the true cause of death was never proven. What followed was even messier. The Western Roman Empire plunged into chaos. Arbogast installed a puppet ruler, and yet another civil war ignited, all triggered by a corpse in a bathtub and 100 unanswered questions. Valentinian II's death may not be the most gruesome on our list or the most absurd, but it wins the prize for most suspicious silence. Because if there's one thing history teaches us, it's this. When emperors die in bathtubs, somebody probably helped. In the sun-drenched city of Argos, where marble temples gleamed and the sea breeze tangled with the scent of olive trees, a frail girl named Telesilla was born into a life of quiet expectation. Her family was aristocratic, wealthy enough to afford luxury, educated enough to afford poetry. But their daughter was seen as delicate, sickly, and unlikely to leave much mark on the world beyond the home's shaded courtyards. From a young age, Telesilla suffered from chronic illness. We don't know exactly what plagued her. Ancient records rarely give us such mercy, but she was often bedridden, a passive observer of life's energy from behind linen curtains. In a society that prized athleticism and public presence, especially among men, Telesilla's physical weakness could have been a sentence to obscurity. But here's where fate, or perhaps the muses, intervened. Unable to join the bustling life of the agora or the festivals of Hera, Telesilla turned inward, and inward she found poetry. Lines and rhythm became her companions. Words were her resistance. Instead of falling into despair, she began composing verses, some say with the same fluency others used to breathe. Her poems honored Apollo, Artemis, Athena, divine beings of strategy, healing, and war. It's almost ironic, considering what would come later. And as her poetry deepened, something else changed. Pausanias, the ancient travel writer, claimed that through her dedication to the muses and the act of writing itself, Telesilla's body began to heal. Slowly, steadily she grew stronger. It's possible that she took part in ritual purification or simply found purpose that revitalized her. Whatever the reason, she emerged not just as a poet, but as a woman reborn, with voice, strength, and startling clarity. In time, her works became widely admired. Her name passed from symposium to symposium, and her lyrics stirred something deep in the hearts of Argive women. She wasn't just crafting verse. She was crafting identity. She gave her city its voice. And though no one could know it yet, that voice would soon echo not in the theater, but on the battlefield. Because this poetess wasn't done surprising the world, not by a long shot. As Telesilla's name grew within Argos, her home became a place of quiet reverence, not for wealth or beauty, but for her words. She wrote with a particular focus on the gods, especially Apollo and Artemis, the divine siblings of healing, precision, and purity. Her hymns didn't merely praise. They invoked presence. These were not empty rituals. These were spiritual calls to arms of the soul. Her verses were likely recited at temples and sacred festivals, sung by choruses of young women dressed in white, their voices rising beneath sun-scorched columns. Through her poetry, Telesilla provided not only spiritual expression but also emotional education. She reminded the people of Argos, especially its women, that they too were part of the divine tapestry. They weren't merely spectators in a male-dominated mythos. They were woven into the narrative. And while men debated politics in the agora, it was Telesilla's verses that seeped into the minds of Argive daughters. In a world where education for women was rare, poetry was their inheritance. Her hymns taught them reverence, strength, even defiance, wrapped delicately in metaphor and rhythm. But it was more than just literature. For Telesilla, these hymns were medicine. Ancient accounts suggest that her devotion to poetic discipline helped cure her lifelong illness. Though we might roll our eyes at the idea of writing your way to health, there's something timeless in this concept. She found purpose, and perhaps in doing so, she found resilience. The more she wrote, the more she stood. The more she stood, the more people listened. And Argos needed her voice, because war was coming. The city had been growing complacent, leaning too heavily on its past glories and underestimating the tensions rising around it. Sparta, that eternal neighbor to the south, had already shown its teeth more than once. And while the men of Argos continued their debates, no one suspected that a poet, the once sickly girl who healed herself with verse, would soon become their rallying cry. In many ways, Telesilla was already preparing her city. Her hymns didn't just soothe, they steeled. They became quiet rehearsals for something louder, bloodier, and more urgent. When the time came, the women of Argos would already know the rhythm of defiance because she had already taught them how to sing it. The year was around 494 BCE, and Argos stood on the edge of disaster. Tensions with Sparta had finally snapped. The Battle of Sepiae erupted, an ambush staged with Spartan precision and Argive miscalculation. The Argive men, confident in their numbers and tradition, fell into a trap laid by King Cleomenes of Sparta. It was brutal, systematic, a massacre dressed in strategy. Hundreds of Argive soldiers were slaughtered. Some say nearly the entire male fighting force of the city was wiped out. What remained was a shell of a city, its gates open, its warriors dead, its fate seemingly sealed. Argos lay defenseless. And Sparta knew it. What Cleomenes didn't know, what perhaps no one could have predicted, was that behind those bloodied city walls was not just grief and ruin. There was Telesilla. In the aftermath of the battle, as wails of mourning echoed through marble halls and temples, it would have been easy, expected even, for the people of Argos to surrender. Many probably considered it. But somewhere among the collapsed morale, Telesilla stepped forward, not with a spear but, with fire in her eyes, she rallied the women. The story, preserved in fragments by later historians like Plutarch and Pausanias, is nothing short of astounding. Telesilla, the poetess once confined by illness, now stood before her fellow citizens, mothers, daughters, widows, and called them to arms, literally. They gathered every weapon they could find, spears once mounted on walls, shields left behind by the fallen, even stones and farming tools repurposed. And in the shadow of that ancient city, women began training. The elderly, the young, even the servants, they all prepared for what was coming. Telesilla organized it. This wasn't some mythic fever dream. It was strategy. She positioned women at top battlements to give the illusion that Argos was still fully defended. She drilled them in formations. They were not trained soldiers, but they were fierce, determined, and above all, furious. The city waited, breath held. The Spartans would return. Everyone knew it. But when they did, expecting a broken city ready to kneel, they found something else entirely. A wall lined with women, armed, prepared, led by a poet with no crown, no title, just command in her voice. Argos had fallen, and now it would rise again. The Spartan army returned expecting plunder. After all, they had decimated Argos's military. What remained, they assumed, were civilians too broken to fight back, an easy conquest, maybe even a lesson in Spartan mercy. But what greeted them at the gates of Argos was no surrender. It was spectacle. It was defiance. It was Telesilla. The walls were lined with women, fully armed, their eyes steady, their posture unshaken. Their commander, a woman once known only for poetry, now stood tall, directing strategy like a general born of war. And then the women attacked. The battle was not elegant. This was not the heroic ideal of shield walls and bronze-plated honor. It was chaos, furious, unrelenting, and intimate. These women fought with whatever they had. Spears stabbed from above the ramparts. Boiling water scalded Spartan helmets. Stones rained like curses. It was as much psychological as it was physical. The Spartans, trained for disciplined combat against soldiers, were suddenly locked in brutal melee with people they were not prepared to kill, women. And that hesitation cost them. Pausanias, who recorded the tale centuries later, wrote that the women of Argos, under Telesilla's leadership, forced the Spartans to retreat. It sounds improbable, doesn't it? But context matters. The Spartans had won their main objective. They had already defeated Argos' male army. What they faced now was resistance that risked shattering the legend of Spartan invincibility. To lose men to a citizen militia led by women wasn't just dangerous, it was humiliating. And humiliation in Sparta was worse than death. So they withdrew. Let that settle for a moment. Telesilla, a poet trained not in arms but in verse, had led a group of grieving, enraged, determined women and saved a city. Not in myth, not in allegory, but in recorded human history. This victory wasn't just military. It was symbolic. It changed the narrative of Argos. It redefined what women could do in the face of devastation. And it proved something Sparta hadn't expected, that courage doesn't wear a beard, and leadership isn't born only on the battlefield. That day, Argos didn't fall to Sparta. It stood taller than ever, held up by hands that had once only held lyres. And it was Telesilla who handed the city its second breath. Victory had a strange taste. The city of Argos had survived, but it was changed. Its streets still echoed with grief. Its temples bore the bloodstains of husbands, brothers, and sons who never came home. But over all that silence stood something remarkable, a new kind of legacy, stitched together by women's hands and Telesilla's unshakable resolve. She didn't claim power. She didn't crown herself queen or sit upon a throne. Telesilla returned to her poetry. It might seem anticlimactic, but this was precisely her genius. She didn't fight for personal glory. She fought because her city needed her. And once Argos was safe, she resumed what she loved, composing hymns and honoring the gods. But now her verses had new weight. They weren't just lyrics sung at festivals. They were reminders, living memories set to meter. Imagine the girls of Argos growing up in the shadow of that victory, whispering stories of the poet general who once led their mothers into battle. Imagine their voices reciting her verses under moonlight, not just as ritual, but as power. Telesilla's poetry had become prophecy, and prophecy had become precedent. The city honored her not just in song but in stone. A statue was erected in the temple of Aphrodite, showing Telesilla seated calmly with scrolls at her feet, one hand upon her lyre, the other resting on her shield, not as a contradiction but as a complete truth. She was both artist and warrior, and she had shown her city that those identities were not only compatible, they were necessary. Elsewhere in Greece, the story spread. Telesilla became a symbol not only of Argive resilience but of womanly courage in a world that rarely allowed such narratives to breathe. Philosophers debated her. Poets echoed her themes. And in time, her name was preserved in collections of heroic women standing shoulder to shoulder with queens and oracles. But perhaps most powerful of all was the silence that followed. She didn't chase war. She didn't court conflict. Her defense of Argos was an act of necessity, not ego. When peace returned, so did she, to her ink, to her rhythm, to the private, sacred space where poems were born. And in doing so, she proved that real strength isn't measured in how long you hold the sword, but in knowing exactly when to put it down. Telesilla's name began to stretch beyond the city walls of Argos, carried not by armies but by admirers. Her story, part history, part legend, was whispered in symposiums, etched into scrolls, and retold in hushed admiration by men who never thought they'd speak of a woman as both poet and protector. She was not mythologized into a goddess. She remained human, and that made her all the more powerful. Her dual legacy resonated deeply across the Greek world because it broke a mold that many didn't realize could be broken. In an era when women were expected to be silent, invisible, or ornamental, Telesilla was none of those things. She was educated, expressive, and when the moment came, fierce. And yet, even her poetry was not lost to time. Some of her verses survived, cited by later grammarians and scholars. Though fragmentary, they suggest a rich, reverent tone, filled with invocations of the divine, vivid imagery, and a deep understanding of ritual. She didn't just write. She shaped the sacred. It's difficult to say how much of her work has vanished into history's abyss. Like so many women of antiquity, her voice was preserved only in pieces, filtered through the pens of men centuries after her death. But even these remnants are enough. They speak of a woman who believed in beauty, in community, in purpose, and in the capacity of language to build more than verse, to build courage, memory, resistance. Artists later depicted her surrounded by scrolls and shields, sometimes crowned with laurel, sometimes simply sitting alone in contemplation, always poised between song and silence, art and action. She inspired later generations of women, though subtly, like a steady flame that never quite goes out. In the Hellenistic period and even into Roman times, her name appeared in anthologies, a rare inclusion among lists. Dominated by male voices, her story wasn't repeated out of novelty. It was repeated because it mattered. Telesilla of Argos wasn't the loudest warrior, nor the most prolific poet, but she was something rarer, a woman who moved between two worlds with grace, fire, and intent. And in doing so, she forced the world to take notice, not with conquest, but with clarity. As centuries passed, the name Telesilla began to fade, not from legend but from mainstream history. Like so many women of the ancient world, her memory was tucked into footnotes, her achievements mentioned only in fragments and often with a tone of polite surprise, as though it was somehow an accident that a woman had done something remarkable. The Hellenistic world, with its shifting power centers and cultural transformations, began favoring different kinds of heroes, conquerors, philosophers, kings. In this new climate, a woman poet who defended her city with wit and will didn't quite fit the mold of the stories that empires like to tell. By the time Roman authors picked up her name, it was almost folkloric. Plutarch mentions her with a kind of rhetorical curiosity, less interested in her verse or her politics and more in the idea that a woman had ever wielded command at all. To him and many of his contemporaries, Telesilla was an anomaly, a remarkable exception, a rare flower in a man's garden. But this is where history itself betrays us. Because it wasn't just Telesilla who vanished from the center of the narrative. It was countless women like her, leaders, thinkers, poets, whose stories were deemed too inconvenient to preserve in full. The scrolls were lost. The statues were repurposed or destroyed. The voices were silenced not by violence, but by centuries of editorial neglect. And yet, Telesilla persisted. Her story survived not because it was allowed to, but because it was too compelling to kill. Because the image of a woman standing atop a city wall, shield in one hand, verse in the other, simply refused to go quietly. That kind of image doesn't disappear. It smolders in memory, reignites in times of crisis, and whispers to each new generation that bravery wears many faces, and some of them wear veils. In modern times, historians and feminists alike have begun to revisit her legacy. Not to exaggerate it, but to reclaim it, to dust off the silence and examine what happens when we let the full weight of a woman's story stand beside her male counterparts. And in doing so, we don't just remember Telesilla. We remember what history tried to forget. Though much of ancient Greece has crumbled, its statues worn smooth, its scrolls turned to dust, Telesilla's legacy still lingers in three enduring forms: stone, scroll, and sisterhood. First, the stone. In the ancient sanctuary of Aphrodite in Argos, long after the war cries faded, the statue of Telesilla once stood. Not a grand marble colossus, but a thoughtful monument. She was depicted seated calmly, her scrolls scattered at her feet, her hand resting on a helmet. No raised sword, no dramatic stance, just a moment of stillness, an image of a woman who had mastered both art and action. Even the placement in Aphrodite's temple was deliberate. Not Athena, the goddess of war and wisdom, but Aphrodite, goddess of love, beauty, and perhaps here, resilience. It was a quiet revolution carved in stone. Then came the scrolls. Though most of Telesilla's poetry is lost, what little remains reveals a voice rich with reverence and clarity. Scholars across centuries have tried to piece together her verses, finding in them not only artistic merit but emotional insight. Her style belonged to the lyric tradition, intimate, melodic, charged with spiritual devotion. She was not writing for spectacle. She was writing for the soul. And perhaps that's why her words survived longer than her battles. And finally, the sisterhood. Telesilla's story became a kind of coded anthem for women through the ages, especially for those denied swords, votes, or recognition. She offered something more enduring than strategy: permission. Permission to act, to speak, to lead, to protect. She wasn't just a historical figure. She was a mirror, one in which generations of women could see their own potential reflected, no matter how obscured by time. Her tale has inspired plays, poems, even academic treatises. In feminist readings of ancient history, she is no longer a footnote. She is a cornerstone, a reminder that when institutions fall silent, individuals can still shout. That when history closes a door, memory opens a window. In classrooms, in books, in whispered conversations among those hungry for forgotten heroines, Telesilla lives on. She is the patron saint of the underestimated. The poet who chose not only to sing of heroes but to become one. Telesilla never asked to be remembered. She didn't command monuments or beg for her name to be etched in history. And yet here we are, over 2,000 years later, still speaking her name, still telling her story, still aided by what she did in a world that tried to forget her kind. What makes her legacy so compelling is not just that she fought or that she wrote, but that she did both when neither was expected nor allowed of someone like her. A sickly girl with a lyre was never supposed to lead a militia. A woman who composed hymns wasn't meant to rewrite the fate of a city, but she did. And not through divine intervention or noble birth, but through clarity, purpose, and grit. In the grand tapestry of Greek history, full of heroes with bronze muscles and flowing capes, Telesilla stands apart. She doesn't roar like Achilles or scheme like Odysseus. She does something far harder. She holds the line. She looks into the face of collapse, and she does not flinch. Not because she was fearless, but because someone had to act and no one else did. And that's what makes her echo last. She reminds us that heroism doesn't always come with a trumpet blast or a poet's blessing. Sometimes it comes in the form of a woman who picks up a sword with shaking hands, steadies herself, and says, "Not today." Today, scholars and creatives alike continue to draw inspiration from her. Her story is taught in feminist studies, referenced in discussions about women in warfare, and even invoked in debates about the fluidity of roles across gender and class. She has become not just a symbol of Argos, but of resistance itself. And if you listen carefully, her voice still hums beneath the surface of modern tales, in every woman who steps up when others step back, in every artist who refuses to stay in their lane, in every act of courage that begins with a whisper and ends in thunder. Telesilla's legacy is not locked in the past. It is alive, breathing, moving quietly through the world. Because the truth is, the lyre was never put down. It was simply transformed into something sharper. Before arches, before blueprints, before even the idea of architecture, there was a simple human need: to get from one side to the other. Across rushing rivers, deep ravines, and perilous chasms, the early ancestors of humanity faced a question as old as travel itself. How do you cross when the land disappears? The very first bridges were not built by engineers. They were stumbled upon by wanderers and hunters who noticed a fallen tree spanning a stream or watched vines drape across a gorge. These early crossings weren't planned. They were found. Nature gave the hint, and humans took the cue. A fallen log, a line of stones placed just right, this was where bridges were born. Out of curiosity, out of fear, out of hunger. Over time, those accidental crossings became intentional. In rainforests, people began binding together vines and reeds to form hanging footpaths. These weren't exactly stable. You wouldn't want to cross one in the dark, but they were a beginning, a literal lifeline between food and famine, isolation and community. In parts of what is now South America, early civilizations began using twisted plant fibers to create longer suspended crossings. These weren't just primitive ropes. They were woven, reinforced, and tested with centuries of refinement. The Incas, long before the Spanish conquest, perfected the art of the rope bridge. But even before the Inca Empire, the peoples of the Andes were mastering techniques that required deep understanding of tension, weight distribution, and natural materials. What makes these early bridges remarkable is not their size but their boldness. Imagine looking at a river gorge hundreds of feet deep, and instead of walking away, you begin tying grass together. That's not just ingenuity. It's a kind of bravery wrapped in necessity. These first crossings changed more than routes. They changed relationships. Once two valleys were linked, ideas flowed as easily as people. Trade routes emerged. Languages mingled. Cultural exchange was born on shaky ropes and damp planks. A bridge, even the humblest one, is always more than wood and fiber. It's an invitation, a statement, a quiet refusal to let nature have the final say. In those earliest spans, civilizations took their first steps toward connection and never looked back. High in the Andes Mountains, where cliffs dropped like knives and rivers roar with glacial melt, the Inca Empire wove its own answer to nature's brutal geography. The Incas didn't just build bridges, they tied the sky together. Their roads ran for thousands of miles across mountains and valleys. But it was the rope bridges, or Quishuachica, that truly defied imagination. These bridges were made entirely of grass. Not wood, not metal, not stone, just woven strands of ichu, a tough mountain grass twisted into cords, and those cords twisted into cables. The process wasn't just technical. It was ceremonial. Entire villages would gather once a year to build or rebuild these bridges by hand. Each family was responsible for a section of rope. They braided, chanted, and hauled, working in a rhythm passed down through generations. The resulting bridge could stretch across a 100-foot canyon, swaying with every gust of mountain wind. No nails, no bolts, just pure tension and trust. And yet, these rope bridges were strong enough to support llamas, soldiers, messengers, and traders. They were the beating arteries of an empire spanning canyons where no stone could be placed. And they were elegant in their own way, suspended like cobwebs across the void. They moved with the wind instead of fighting it. They bent, swayed, and sighed, but rarely broke. When one did collapse, it wasn't treated as a failure. It was simply the end of a cycle, ready to be born again by the hands of those who lived along its path. These rope bridges weren't just infrastructure. They were sacred. The annual rebuilding was a living ritual, a reminder that the land was not to be conquered but worked with. That connection required not brute force, but harmony. No empire understood this better than the Incas. Even today, one rope bridge remains in use. The last Quishuachica, still rebuilt annually by local communities near Huanuray, Peru. UNESCO has recognized it as intangible cultural heritage. Tourists cross it gingerly. Locals cross it with muscle memory. In a world that increasingly forgets how to repair, the Inca Bridge reminds us of something ancient and vital, that strength doesn't always come from stone. Sometimes it comes from woven grass, shared labor, and the will to meet across the void. Far from the wind-tossed Andes, across the rivers of ancient China, another philosophy of bridge building was taking root, one that favored permanence over flexibility, symmetry over sway. Chinese engineers saw bridges not just as tools but as expressions of balance, of earth, water, and heaven connected in stone. As early as the Zhou dynasty, Chinese builders had been experimenting with wooden and pontoon bridges. But it was during the Han and later the Sui and Tang dynasties that something extraordinary emerged, the segmental arch bridge. Unlike the steep Roman arch, which relied on a high curve, the Chinese approach flattened the arch, giving their bridges a gentle rise and greater stability under dynamic loads like carts and animals. These were not just aesthetic choices. They were masterclasses in tension and compression. Take, for example, the Shao Bridge, built in the early 7th century by the engineer Li Chun. Spanning 123 feet with a 37-foot high arch, it remains one of the oldest surviving open spandrel stone bridges in the world. It's not just old, it's brilliant. Li Chun designed it with smaller secondary arches along the base to reduce weight and water resistance during floods. His understanding of both structure and natural forces was centuries ahead of his time. But Chinese bridges weren't only feats of engineering. They were deeply poetic. Many were built near temples or gardens, reflecting ideals of Taoist harmony and Confucian order. The bridge wasn't just a crossing. It was a moment, a pause between destinations, a chance to contemplate the still water below and the swirling heavens above. Stone lions often guarded the entrances, not merely as decoration but as symbols of protection. Bridge names were chosen with care, often invoking luck, longevity, or spiritual awakening. And for scholars and artists of the Tang and Song dynasties, bridges became a favorite subject in painting and verse. A simple walk across one could become a metaphor for everything: change, connection, and the quiet strength of staying still amid motion. In ancient China, bridges were more than civil works. They were spiritual geometry. Each stone laid not just with skill but with philosophy. To cross one wasn't just to travel. It was to pass through balance itself. If China built with harmony, Rome built with ambition. For the Romans, a bridge wasn't just a way to cross a river. It was a declaration: we are here and we will stay. As the Roman Empire expanded, it faced an endless parade of rivers, valleys, and gorges. But where others saw obstacles, Rome saw blueprints. The Romans took what the Etruscans had started, arch technology, and turned it into something monumental and permanent. Using stone, concrete, and sheer willpower, Roman engineers constructed bridges that didn't just survive time, they defined it. One of the most famous is the Pons Fabricius, built in 62 BCE, which still carries foot traffic across the Tiber River today. That's more than 2 millennia of wear and war, flood and footstep, and still standing. The genius of the Roman bridge lay in its arch. A Roman arch distributed weight evenly, channeling force into the ground. It allowed bridges to span wider rivers and support heavier loads. And with the invention of pozzolanic concrete, which could set underwater, Roman builders gained flexibility their rivals couldn't match. But function was never enough for Rome. These bridges were built with grandeur. They were often faced with marble or limestone, inscribed with the names of emperors, adorned with statues and triumphal messages. Some were even designed as part of aqueducts, like the breathtaking Pont du Gard in modern-day France, which served as both a water channel and a towering architectural statement. For Roman legions, bridges meant speed. For Roman merchants, they meant prosperity. And for the empire itself, they meant permanence. The roads of Rome were famously straight and unyielding, but it was the bridges that made those roads matter. Wherever Rome went, it bridged the gap, literally and metaphorically, between conquest and civilization. A bridge wasn't just infrastructure. It was empire in miniature, orderly, strong, and built to last. Even after the empire fell, many Roman bridges remained, used, rebuilt, reimagined. The stones whispered of a time when engineers walked hand in hand with emperors, and when rivers, no matter how wide or wild, bowed to the Roman will. To cross a Roman bridge was to walk in the footsteps of conquerors and to feel the weight of eternity under your feet. While Rome built in stone and China in symmetry, ancient India quietly cultivated a bridge tradition that was unlike anything else on earth: bridges made from trees. Not cut wood, not rope, not carved beams, living, growing trees. In the wet, hilly region of Meghalaya in the northeast of the Indian subcontinent, rivers are fed by relentless monsoons. Flash floods sweep away bamboo, rope, and timber bridges with ease. But centuries ago, the Khasi and Jaintia peoples found a way to use nature not as an obstacle but as a partner. They began guiding the roots of the Ficus elastica tree, a type of rubber fig, across streams and rivers, slowly, patiently. Over years, then decades, the roots were trained using hollowed-out tree trunks, scaffolding, and bamboo frames to grow toward the opposite bank. When the roots met, they were woven and anchored into the soil, creating a bridge that was quite literally alive. These living root bridges didn't rot. They didn't splinter. In fact, they grew stronger with age. A young bridge might take 15 years to become usable. But once mature, it could last hundreds of years, sustained by the very land it stood on. This was not fast architecture. It was generational. A grandfather would begin weaving a bridge that his grandchildren might one day walk across. There was no blueprint, only tradition. No calculation, only intuition, passed down through watching, doing, and remembering. And these bridges weren't just functional. They were breathtaking, suspended among waterfalls and emerald valleys. The root bridges curved and twisted like something from a fairy tale, organic and surreal, blending into the jungle as if grown by myth. In a world that often values speed, India's living bridges are a defiant slow song. They show that time, care, and cooperation with nature can produce wonders just as lasting as stone. They are community projects, sacred paths, a reminder that not all strength is rigid. Some of it is woven, flexible, and alive. To cross a root bridge is to cross into a different rhythm of civilization, one that listens to the earth rather than reshaping it. And in that quiet balance, India bridged more than rivers. It bridged the wild itself. In the cradle of civilization, where the Tigris and Euphrates carved ribbons through desert and city, early Mesopotamians faced a familiar problem: rivers that both nourished and separated. These waterways brought trade, irrigation, and life. But they also created boundaries. And where boundaries exist, someone eventually builds a bridge. Unlike the later empires of stone and steel, ancient Mesopotamians worked with what they had: mud, brick, timber, and ingenuity. Their rivers were broad but not bottomless. Their materials were fragile, but their minds were not. The city of Babylon, one of the jewels of ancient Mesopotamia, was famously divided by the Euphrates River but was also famously connected. The Greek historian Herodotus claimed that Babylon had an early movable bridge, constructed of wooden planks laid across boats and tied together with papyrus ropes. By day, it ferried people and carts. By night, it was dismantled to prevent enemy access. Whether this account is precise or poetic, it reflects a truth: Mesopotamian cities were not isolated settlements. They were logistical masterpieces. Bridges here were not just structures. They were strategies. Some were built low and temporary, designed to be rebuilt after floods. Others were made with baked bricks and asphalt mortar, resting on foundations driven deep into silt and clay. Mesopotamians understood the river's moods. They didn't try to conquer water with brute force. They tried to work around it, above it, and sometimes even under it. Trade caravans carrying grain, textiles, and lapis lazuli needed bridges. Temples and ziggurats drew pilgrims from opposite shores, and kings, forever in need of control, understood that whoever held the bridge controlled the city. Over time, as empires like the Assyrians and Persians rose, their bridges grew in complexity. Engineers began incorporating stone piers and more permanent wooden spans. But the roots of that engineering went back to the simplest acts: bundling reeds, piling clay, stretching logs. The logic of bridging, the why, came long before the how. Mesopotamian bridges may not have survived the centuries like Rome's or inspired poetry like China's, but they formed a vital foundation. They were among the first expressions of infrastructure, the bones of organized society. They taught us that where there is commerce, there must be connection. And where there is water, someone will always try to walk across it. To the ancient Greeks, the world was not just a place to live. It was a canvas to be shaped, measured, and perfected. And when it came to bridges, they brought the same thoughtful attention to proportion, harmony, and engineering that they poured into their temples and sculptures. Unlike the Romans, the Greeks weren't obsessed with spanning vast distances or showcasing imperial power. Their bridges were often more modest but no less intelligent. Built across small rivers, marshes, or rocky gaps, these structures were crafted with an elegant balance of form and function. Take the Artico Bridge, located in the Peloponnese, dating back to the Bronze Age around 1300 BC. It's one of the oldest surviving arch bridges in the world. Built of large unmortared limestone boulders, the bridge still stands today, quietly carrying foot traffic as it did millennia ago. There are no inscriptions, no imperial eagles, no towering arches, just a single, subtle span built with precision and enduring grace. The Greeks understood stone. They understood load-bearing. And perhaps most importantly, they understood the importance of community connectivity. Many of their early roads and bridges were part of sacred routes used during religious festivals and processions to temples, such as the long journey to Delphi or Olympia. In these contexts, a bridge wasn't just about moving people. It was about guiding them toward the divine. Later, during the classical and Hellenistic periods, Greek cities began incorporating more advanced engineering methods, borrowing and adapting Etruscan and Eastern techniques. Timber and stone were used together. Some bridges even included drainage systems, careful grading, and guardrails. Still, aesthetics mattered. A Greek bridge didn't just serve a function. It fit into the landscape, enhancing rather than dominating it. It was common to find bridges positioned for viewing, often offering perfect symmetry with the surrounding hills and sky, water below, air above, and stone in between. The Greeks liked their elements balanced. In Greek thought, the bridge became more than a crossing. It was a metaphor, a movement between worlds, between cities, between gods and mortals, between chaos and order. So while their spans may not stretch as far as Rome's, the Greek bridge stands as a quiet whisper in stone, strong, serene, and built with thought rather than thunder. In the land of towering pyramids and mighty pharaohs, ancient Egypt didn't need to conquer rivers as often as it needed to navigate them. The Nile, both giver and taker of life, served more as a highway than a barrier. Boats were the bridges of Egypt. But that didn't mean Egyptians ignored the art of crossing land-based gaps. When they did build bridges, they did so with intention and with unmistakable symbolism. Egyptian civilization grew along the fertile banks of the Nile, where irrigation channels, canals, and ditches distributed water up the land. To manage this watery maze, the Egyptians developed small-scale bridges, flat stone causeways, wooden crossings, and canal bridges designed more for function than spectacle. One of the earliest known examples comes from the workers' village at Deir el-Medina near the Valley of the Kings. Archaeologists have discovered narrow stone walkways and raised paths designed to carry foot traffic over irrigation ditches and sunken terrain. These weren't monumental in size, but they were smartly built using local stone, carefully leveled surfaces, and alignment with prevailing routes. And then there's the Great Causeways, those long, sloping stone paths that connected the Nile to the pyramids at Giza. While technically not bridges, these structures acted as ceremonial links between the river and the tombs of the dead. Massive and meticulously constructed, these causeways were used to transport the pharaoh's funerary goods, chariots, and even his mummified body during grand religious processions. In these causeways, we see something more than transport. We see spiritual transition, a passage from life to death, from one world to another. The bridge in Egypt wasn't always a structure you walked across. It was an idea. The soul crossed into the afterlife. The king moved from mortal dust to divine eternity. As Egypt expanded and urbanized, more bridges appeared over canals and smaller water networks, often tied to temple precincts or granary systems. Some were likely made of wood, lost to time, but their foundations, stone piers, and embankments remained buried beneath desert and field. The Egyptian bridge was never a monument to conquest. It was a conduit of water, of grain, of sacred memory. Not grand in form, perhaps, but monumental in what it represented, the eternal journey between shores, seen and unseen. By the time the ancient world began to fade into the medieval, its bridges remained quiet, immovable witnesses to the ambitions, fears, and brilliance of early civilizations. Some crumbled, buried by flood or forgotten war. Others, remarkably, still stand. A root bridge in India, a Roman arch in France, a Greek limestone span in the Peloponnese. Silent but unbroken. What unites all these ancient bridges, whether born of grass, stone, wood, or myth, is that they were acts of faith. Not religious faith necessarily, but human faith. That we could overcome separation. That we could connect what nature had divided. That the people on the other side were worth reaching. Every civilization had its own approach. The Incas used tension. The Romans used compression. The Chinese used curvature. The Mesopotamians used buoyancy. But the principle was the same: link what cannot be left. Make distance irrelevant. And each bridge said something about the people who built it. The Incas trusted time. The Greeks trusted balance. The Egyptians trusted eternity. The Romans, they trusted concrete. But even beyond function and philosophy, bridges told stories. A rope bridge whispered of community. A Roman aqueduct thundered empire. A Chinese stone arch spoke of harmony. They didn't just carry bodies. They carried beliefs, identities, and purpose. Some bridges were born in urgency, built quickly after a war or flood. Others were born in ritual, raised in song, rebuilt in ceremony, maintained not by kings but by farmers and children. All of them required cooperation. No one builds a bridge alone. You need hands, patience, and hope. And perhaps that's why they still resonate with us today. Not because we're impressed by ancient tools or clever math, but because we recognize the courage it takes to build something between danger and safety, between isolation and unity, between now and the generations to come. In a world that often pulls itself apart, ancient bridges remind us of something quieter, older, and wiser. That connection is worth the effort. That strength can be gentle. That sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is simply reach out. So the next time you cross an old bridge, pause. You're walking on the remains of ancient dreams, and they're still holding. Before there were words carved into clay or hymns sung in stone temples, there was sound. Not organized music in the way we know it, but raw, instinctive rhythm, nature's own symphony waiting to be noticed. The crackling of fire, the patterned drip of rain, the rustle of leaves, the rhythmic thump of feet. These were the first instruments. And somewhere along the way, early humans stopped just listening. They started imitating. The earliest musical instruments known to us come from the Paleolithic period. Among them, flutes made from bird bones and mammoth ivory found in caves in Germany and dated to over 40,000 years ago. They had holes carefully drilled along their bodies, designed to control pitch, not just make noise. These weren't toys. They were tools of emotion. Imagine it in the flickering dark of a cave, someone gently blowing into a carved bone, the notes echoing like whispers through stone. A lullaby for a child, a chant for the hunt, a sound to soothe the dying or stir the sacred. These first notes weren't just entertainment. They were memory made audible. Early music likely served functional roles. Rhythmic clapping or drumming could synchronize group labor, build morale, or intimidate enemies. Repetition made things memorable. Long before writing, information was sung, not said. Melody was a mnemonic device, anchoring knowledge to tone and pattern. The beginning of oral tradition is, in many ways, the beginning of music. In tribal rituals across ancient cultures, we see evidence of percussion instruments. Wooden slats, seed rattles, stretched animal skins struck in time. These tools helped bind communities together, providing a shared experience that required no translation. You didn't need to speak the same language to move to the same beat. Music likely emerged alongside and intertwined with spiritual belief. In early burials, we find instruments placed beside the dead, flutes, drums, bells, as if the journey to the next world required accompaniment. Or perhaps the music was meant for the living, echoing with grief, hope, or a longing to reach beyond the veil. In these earliest sounds, we weren't just surviving. We were beginning to express ourselves, to remember, to celebrate, to mourn. Before we built cities or wrote myths, we sang. In the Fertile Crescent of Mesopotamia, where the Tigris and Euphrates carved paths of life through desert and clay, music was not a pastime. It was a necessity. From Sumer to Babylon, from temple to tavern, sound shaped identity, order, and the divine. The Mesopotamians didn't just play music, they recorded it, structured it, and tied it tightly to the heavens. Among the earliest visual records of musical culture come from Sumerian cylinder seals and reliefs dating back to the 3rd millennium BC. These tiny artworks depict musicians holding lyres, flutes, and drums. But the true marvel lies in what archaeologists later uncovered, the lyres of elaborate instruments adorned with gold, lapis lazuli, and carved bullheads. These were not mere tools. They were sacred objects, buried with the elite, meant to accompany souls into the afterlife. The Mesopotamian lyre was delicate and resonant. Its strings stretched across a wooden frame and were played with plucking fingers or bone picks. Musicians were professionals, some temple-trained, others court-oriented. Music accompanied rituals, coronations, banquets, and battles. Every occasion had its sound. And then there's the real marvel, notation. A clay tablet from Ugarit, dated to around 1400 BCE, is considered one of the world's oldest surviving examples of written music. It contains hymns inscribed in uniform notation, not only with lyrics but musical instructions using a system of relative pitch. We don't fully understand how to hear it as the ancients did, but the very fact it exists reveals how central music was to structure and spirituality. Music was also tied to cosmology. Numbers mattered. Intervals mattered. Ancient Mesopotamian thinkers, like those in Babylon, believed music could reflect the order of the cosmos, mirroring the same harmony that kept planets in orbit and seasons on time. This idea would ripple into Greek philosophy centuries later. Whether sung by priestesses to Inanna or played by traveling minstrels in crowded markets, music in Mesopotamia was layered. It was professional, sacred, celebratory, and political. It carried messages between mortals and gods. In a world carved from mud and mystery, music gave shape to things unseen, binding memory to ritual, order to time, and the soul to its story. In ancient Egypt, where gods had animal heads and pharaohs were divine, music flowed like the Nile, constant, sacred, and life-giving. It echoed in temple courts, drifted through market stalls, and accompanied every stage of human life, from birth to burial. Egyptian music wasn't ornamental. It was essential. The Egyptians believed that music had magical properties. It could calm the gods, heal the sick, and guide the dead. Instruments were gifts from the divine. Most famously, the goddess Hathor, often depicted with a sistrum, a rattle-like instrument used in sacred rites. To shake the sistrum was to awaken life itself. Its jingling tone symbolized the cosmic rhythm of creation. Archaeologists have found harps, flutes, lutes, and lyres painted in two murals dating back to the Old Kingdom around 2500 BC. These instruments weren't generic. They were specific, finely crafted, and richly decorated. Harps came in angular or curved forms, often played sitting on the ground. Their strings, made from animal gut, sang out during both religious ceremonies and court entertainment. Music was deeply woven into Egyptian ritual. Temple hymns were performed at sunrise to greet the gods. Priests and priestesses weren't just readers of sacred texts. They were also trained musicians. Specific tones were believed to align with particular gods or emotions. There was music for lamentation, for praise, for purification. Every act had its sound. But music wasn't just for the elite. Street musicians, dancers, and folk singers filled the markets of Memphis and Thebes. Percussion instruments like frame drums, clappers, and castanets added rhythm to community festivals. Women often led in performance, whether as professional entertainers or as mourners hired to sing the wails of grief at funerals. Egyptian hieroglyphs even give us words for musical moods. Hz implied joy or adoration. Tu meant sorrow or mourning. Music wasn't an abstract art form. It was emotional infrastructure. And when death came, it came with music. Funerary texts sometimes included instructions for chants and instruments. In death, as in life, the journey was not silent. Music in Egypt served many masters, gods, kings, farmers, and mourners. But it always served a deeper truth. That sound was the language of the soul. And through it, even silence had meaning. In ancient Greece, music was more than art. It was mathematics, medicine, philosophy, and divination. It wasn't merely played. It was studied, theorized, worshipped. For the Greeks, music was a mirror of the cosmos, harmonious, ordered, and deeply sacred. The Greek word musik didn't refer to music alone. It encompassed the entire domain of the muses, the goddesses of inspiration for poetry, dance, and song. To engage in music was to draw directly from divine influence. And so, from the street performers of Athens to the philosophers of Ionia, music was both a daily habit and a metaphysical pursuit. Instruments were everywhere. The lyre, a stringed instrument associated with the god Apollo, was central to education. Greek boys, especially of aristocratic backgrounds, learned to play it as part of their formal training. The cithara, a larger and more ornate version of the lyre, was used in professional performances and religious festivals. And then there was the aulos, a double-piped reed instrument with a sharp, penetrating tone, often used to accompany dramatic performances, rituals, and even military exercises. Music was tied intimately to the dramatic arts. In Greek tragedy, choruses didn't just chant, they sang. Entire plays were structured with lyrical meters, turning dialogue into a melodic unfolding of fate. Every step of Oedipus, every lament of Medea, was underscored by rhythm and melody. But behind the performance lay theory. Pythagoras, Yes, the Triangle Guy was among the first to propose that music could be understood numerically. He observed that harmonious notes emerged from simple ratios like 2 to 1 or 3 to 2. From this, the concept of the music of the spheres was born, the idea that the planets themselves moved in cosmic harmony, producing a music too perfect for human ears to hear. Plato and Aristotle expanded on this. Plato believed music shaped the soul and therefore the state. A society's moral health could be gauged by its music. Certain scales and modes were uplifting, others dangerous. Music wasn't just expressive, it was formative. In Greece, to pluck a string was to brush the fabric of reality. To sing was to participate in divine order. And to understand music was to begin to understand the soul itself. When Rome absorbed the cultures around it, it didn't just take their land. It inherited their music. From Etruscan trumpets to Greek lyres, Roman music was a patchwork of styles and traditions woven together under one empire. But unlike the Greeks, who often philosophized about music's moral function, the Romans focused on its practical uses and sometimes its volume. Music in Rome was everywhere. In temples, military camps, theaters, banquets, and the infamous arenas. Music served to command, entertain, and impress. One of the most iconic Roman instruments was the cornu, a large curved brass horn used by the military. When blown, it sent clear signals across the battlefield, orders, formations, and alerts. It wasn't beautiful, but it was effective. For Roman soldiers, music was survival. In civilian life, the soundscape was more elaborate. The tibia, a Roman version of the Greek aulos, was played at sacrifices and public events. The hydraulis, or water. The organ was an early keyboard instrument that used air pressure and water to produce sound. Found in both religious ceremonies and gladiatorial games, it was likely loud, dramatic, and theatrical, perfectly suited for Rome's flair for spectacle. At banquets and private feasts, music took on a more seductive role. Women and enslaved performers often played stringed instruments like the cithara and lute, while dancers moved to soft rhythms. In elite Roman homes, music was a status symbol, an imported art from Greece or Egypt made to dazzle guests and show refinement. But music also had spiritual roots. In Roman religion, certain ceremonies required specific chants and musical forms called carmina. These were sacred incantations believed to influence divine favor or ward off evil. Over time, some evolved into more structured hymns, blending spoken prayer with melody. What Rome lacked in originality, it made up for in adaptability. It absorbed music like it absorbed gods, rebranding, reshaping, and repurposing them to fit its needs. And as Roman roads carried legions across Europe, they also carried songs, instruments, and musical customs. Local tribes encountered not just soldiers, but the sounds of empire. In Rome, music served many ends: glory, control, pleasure, and faith. It was the rhythm of empire pulsing through marble halls and blood-stained sand. Long before Vedic chants echoed through the temples of India, a quieter but equally profound musical culture thrived in the Indus Valley Civilization, one of the world's earliest urban societies. Though much about their music remains elusive, the fragments we've uncovered whisper of a people deeply attuned to rhythm, ritual, and sound. Unlike Mesopotamia or Egypt, the Indus Valley left behind no deciphered texts on music. Yet what they did leave, their instruments, terracotta figurines, and urban acoustics, speaks volumes. Archaeologists have unearthed cylindrical drums, shell trumpets, and carved flutes made of bird bones and terracotta. Some of these flutes, remarkably, have perfectly spaced finger holes, suggesting a sophisticated understanding of pitch and scale. Perhaps most telling are the figurines of dancers found at sites like Mohenjo-daro, limbs frozen mid-step, hair braided, torsos swaying. Where there is dance, there is rhythm. Where there is rhythm, there is music. These figures suggest not only communal celebration but choreographed, percussive culture. The drum wasn't just entertainment, it was expression. Later, as Vedic civilization emerged and Sanskrit texts began to form, the musical tradition of the Indian subcontinent would explode into complexity. But its seeds, those silent ceramic flutes of the Indus, had already taken root. Over time, music in India became inseparable from spiritual practice. The Vedas, the sacred Hindu texts, were chanted in highly regulated melodic patterns called sama. These weren't songs as we know them, they were sound formulas intended to maintain cosmic order. By the time of the Natya Shastra, an ancient treatise on drama, dance, and music composed around 200 BC, Indian music was already categorized into ragas, melodic modes, and talas, rhythmic cycles. Instruments like the veena, an early stringed instrument, and the mridangam, a double-headed drum, became staples of religious and court music. But even as theory deepened, the soul of Indian music remained the same. Music as devotion, music as vibration, music as a bridge between body and spirit, sound and silence, mortal and divine. In the lands of the Indus, music wasn't written in ink. It was written in breath, beat, and eternity. In ancient China, music was never merely sound. It was cosmic order made audible. Rooted in Confucian and Taoist philosophy, early Chinese music sought to mirror the harmony between heaven, earth, and humanity. To play music was not just to entertain but to align oneself with the moral and natural rhythms of the universe. Some of the oldest archaeological finds include stone chimes, bianqing, and bone flutes dating back to the Neolithic period. These instruments were carefully tuned not just for beauty but to reflect cosmic principles. Each note was associated with one of the five elements: wood, fire, earth, metal, water, the seasons, and directions. A melody wasn't just music, it was philosophy and sound. By the time of the Zhou dynasty, 1046 to 256 BCE, music had become a pillar of governance. Confucius himself famously said, "To educate someone, start with poetry, strengthen with ritual, and perfect with music." He believed that music shaped the soul and that a well-governed state would be reflected in its musical culture. Harsh or dissonant music meant disorder. Gentle, orderly tones signified harmony. Court musicians played with instruments like the guqin, a seven-string zither associated with scholars and sages. Its quiet, introspective tones weren't meant to entertain crowds but to cultivate inner virtue. The player sat alone, fingers brushing the strings in a meditative dialogue between self and nature. Larger ensembles used instruments like the sheng, a mouth-blown free reed instrument, drums, and bronze bells, especially in ancestral rites and state ceremonies. The yayue, or elegant music, was the official ceremonial genre used in rituals to honor heaven and ancestors. Every sound, every interval had a ritual function, carefully controlled to avoid spiritual imbalance. Chinese music theory also developed unique scales, such as the pentatonic scale, which uses 5 notes per octave. This gave Chinese melodies their fluid, drifting quality, evoking water, wind, and introspection. In ancient China, to hear music was to hear the balance of the world. To perform it well was to live well. Every note was a prayer, every silence a teaching. In the ancient Hebrew tradition, music was a conduit between heaven and earth, between grief and praise, between people and their covenant with God. It wasn't entertainment. It was sacred. Every note played, every voice lifted was an offering. From the earliest books of the Hebrew Bible, music appears as a central force. In Genesis, Jubal is named as the father of all who play the lyre and pipe, suggesting that even at the very beginning, music was seen as a foundational human gift. In Exodus, after the Red Sea parts and the Israelites escape Egypt, Miriam takes up a timbrel, leading women in dance and song, a moment of celebration carved forever into sacred memory. By the time of King David, music had become a structured, integral part of spiritual life. David himself was both warrior and musician, said to calm King Saul's tormented spirit with the sound of his harp. Under his reign, music flourished as temple ritual. He appointed Levitical musicians whose role was not only to perform but to preserve sacred songs and maintain spiritual order through sound. The Psalms, many attributed to David, form one of the oldest and richest hymnals in human history. These lyrical prayers, written in poetic form, were intended to be sung, chanted, or recited with instrumental accompaniment, usually lyres, harps, cymbals, and trumpets. Some psalms speak of sorrow, others of triumph. but all are musical expressions of the soul in dialogue with the divine. The first temple, built by Solomon, institutionalized music even further. Musicians were assigned shifts. Instruments were standardized. Trumpets signaled offerings. Cymbals marked sacred transitions. Music structured the calendar, framed the festivals, and deepened the meaning of every rite. Even after the temple's destruction, music lived on in memory and exile. In Babylon, the exiled Hebrews sang of Zion with trembling voices. By the rivers of Babylon, there we sat and wept. How can we sing the songs of the Lord in a foreign land? Yet sing they did. Hebrew music survived not by echoing through stone halls, but by being written on hearts. It was a music of resilience, born in covenant and carried across centuries in breath, bone, and prayer. As the ancient world slowly gave way to classical antiquity and the medieval age, the music of early civilizations did not vanish. It transformed. Its instruments were altered, its scales adapted, its traditions absorbed into newer religious, philosophical, and cultural systems. But its essence endured, the echo of a Mesopotamian lyre, the shimmer of an Egyptian sistrum, the silence between strokes on a Chinese guqin. These sounds did not die. They migrated, carried across time in the hands and hearts of those who remembered. In many ways, ancient music is a language we've forgotten how to fully speak but never stopped listening for. We can't hear exactly how a Babylonian hymn sounded. We can only reconstruct it from clay tablets, fragmented notation, and ancient descriptions. But we can feel its intention, its effort to connect body and spirit, time and eternity. Even in the absence of full musical scores, we still see music etched in stone and painted on walls. Dancing priestesses in Minoan frescoes, harpists carved into Assyrian reliefs, Roman mosaics showing cithara players at feasts. These images are static, yet they pulse with rhythm. They remind us that ancient music was never background noise. It was the heartbeat of ritual, the breath of ceremony, the fire of protest, and the balm of grief. And remarkably, some of it lives on. In India, the raga system still follows rules born from ancient Vedic chants. In China, guqin players still perform melodies that date back to Confucian temples. In Jewish synagogues, psalms are still chanted with traditional melodies that echo back thousands of years. These aren't recreations. They are continuations. Ancient music wasn't recorded on vinyl or digitized into streams. It was preserved in practice, in people, in purpose. Passed down not through wires but through witnessing. We may never hear a perfect reconstruction of an Inca festival song or a hymn sung in the court of Mesopotamia. But when a hand drums a beat, or a voice breaks into spontaneous song, or a melody lingers just long enough to bring tears, that is ancient. The civilizations may have crumbled. The empires may have fallen. But their music still plays, not in history books, but in us. So, we've just uncovered some of the most bizarre and unforgettable ways history's most powerful figures met their end, far from heroic, often absurd, but always unforgettable. But don't get too comfortable just yet, because in the next episode of Boring History for Sleep,